Well, what is the Bean Portlet feature and what can it do for you? The Bean Portlet feature is an annotation-driven type of programming. It's a very familiar programming model. If you're a Java EE developer, this would be very familiar to you. And it has first-class support for CDI, which I'm really excited about. More to come about that topic. The Bean Portlet feature comes with some new annotations. It also utilizes some familiar ones. So if you're a CDI or a Java EE developer, you're familiar with @named and @application-scoped, and of course @inject from JSR 3.30. But Portlet 3 extends CDI by introducing some new scopes. We have @portlet_request-scoped, @portlet_session-scoped, and @render_state-scoped. So any Portlet container that implements Portlet 3 has to implement these CDI scopes in order to be compliant. Now, truth be told, you can use the standard @request-scoped or @session-scoped annotations, and Liferay will automatically convert them to Portlet request-scoped and Portlet session-scoped respectively, dynamically. So one of the features of Bean Portlet is the ability to do away with the portlet.xml descriptor. There are developers who really despise XML. I'm not one of them. I think XML is just fine. But it does allow you to use annotations to register your portlet rather than using an XML descriptor. So you can see here in this code fragment, we have the @portlet configuration annotation. And that would be very similar to the portlet element in portlet.xml. And we have some attributes on here for the portlet name, for the title, and so on. And you might notice here, for this class, it does not extend generic portlet, and it does not, nor does it implement the portlet interface or anything like that. Those requirements are gone. So you can just have a POJO annotated with that portlet configuration, and that's a portlet. Portlet 3 provides us with the Bean Portlet method of developing portlets. It provides us with some controller methods. In this example here, I'm using the @render method annotation. So rather than extend generic portlet and override the doView method, I can just have a POJO, and I can create a method. I can call it whatever I want. I don't have to call it doView. In this case, I'm calling it prepareView. It does have to have a special signature to take a render request and a render response. I place the @render method annotation on it. Perhaps I want to specify what JSP I want to render. Perhaps I want to populate the model. Now, in this example, I'm trying to describe how this is kind of a limited model feature. And what I mean by that is the portlet spec itself really doesn't go into the model view controller design pattern. And so that's where the MVCBean feature comes in. This is a new feature for Liferay 7.3, whereby Liferay is going to fortify the portlet spec with an implementation of the MVC spec. This is, again, it's going to be in Liferay 7.3. It's already released in Apache Pluto version 3.1. So what does MVCBean do in order to fortify the Bean Portlet feature that we get from Portlet 3? As I said, it's a portlet implementation of JSR 372, the MVC spec, which is just about to go final at the JCP after a long time. And my best understanding is once it goes final at the JCP, then it will be donated to Jakarta. It provides a nice clean separation of concerns between the model, view, and controller layers of the design pattern. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to run this Archetype Generate command. You have to trust me. I ran it and I deployed it to Liferay, but this is available at the Apache Pluto page if you want to actually try this feature in Pluto 3.1 right now. So you run this Archetype Generate command, and you end up with a portlet that looks like this right here. Very simple form, just with first name and last name. And it has some validation in it, so both fields are required. So if I hit submit, I have a breakpoint set here in IntelliJ, And I wanted to show you what the action method looks like. Well, first of all, this is a class, just a POJO, that I have annotated with @controller. And @controller is from the MVC spec. Okay. And it is a portlet request scoped bean, and I'm able to use @inject in order to inject things that I'm interested in. Binding result is something that comes from the MVC spec. Models is something that comes from the MVC spec as well. And I'm also going to inject a data transfer object, which is user. So when I click the submit button, it comes here, and there are errors here. So if I were to just go next, okay, and then hit go, you can see that I get an error message right here. And if I fill it out correctly, this time it actually goes through, executes the method, and I get today's date and so on. So that's a very simple example of what MVCBean is. So discussing the model, again, it's just you use lightweight POJOs, plain old Java objects, and you can optionally integrate it with bean validation. So what we're trying to do here is, if you are familiar with the Java EE style of development, we want you to be able to take those skills and bring them to Liferay and just have, again, a familiar programming model for you to work with. In this case, you saw it was first name and last name. When I submit the form, what happens is that that field for first name gets injected into the user data transfer object. And that's done with the @inject annotation and also @formParam. @formParam is actually something from JAX-RS. And that's because the MVC spec decided that it was going to kind of standardize on JAX-RS in order to build upon the functionality of JAX-RS in order to fully flesh out the MVC design pattern. So the view is entirely declarative, and I'll give you an example of what that looks like. And the MVC spec provides this abstraction called the view engine. It's a pluggable architecture, and what we're going to support out of the box is, of course, JSP, but also the Thymeleaf templating engine. This is what the view looks like. It's just plain declarative markup, and we've been doing this in technologies like JSF for quite some time with facelets, and it makes heavy use of EL, the expression language. So you can see here the user keyword is actually something from right here. If you can see in the code on the right, where I'm using the @named annotation, that makes the user keyword available to the expression language. So I'm able to access first name right there in the EL. So anyway, it's a very straightforward declarative markup style. There's no JSP scriptlets in it. And I have equivalents of this with HTML Thymeleaf. I can show you. For the controller, if you're doing an MVC web app, not in a Portlet environment, you're going to be using @get and @post from JAX-RS. Again, the MVC spec decided to build upon what was there in JAX-RS. Well, if you think about the Portlet lifecycle, a simple @get or @post doesn't really map quite well to the Portlet lifecycle. So instead, what we decided to do is to just use the controller methods, the annotations that represent controllers for render method, action method, and sort of resource method that we got from Portlet 3. Now for inversion of control, the default IOC engine for @inject, in other words, when I use the @inject annotation, what under the hood is actually causing the injection to take place? The default IOC engine is JBoss Weld, and so Liferay 7.1, CE GA4, and also 7.2 come with Weld OSGi bundle deployed. So this allows us to have very thin, very lightweight WAR modules that take advantage of JBoss Weld, which is that ships out of the box with Liferay. But Liferay also supports usage of @inject with the Spring framework, and I can show you an example of that as well. Now, this is not currently as lightweight, meaning if I wanted to develop a portlet where I had Spring doing my inversion of control, I would have to bundle the Spring jars and web-inflib. We're going to try and make that thin or skinny in the future, in the near future. Okay, so just to show you an example of this, more examples of MVCBean, we have a reference portlet here that we originally did in JSF. So this is just done with JSF and facelets. And it's our reference application where you're just filling out a job application, first name, last name, email address, and so on. And you can do some things like put in a zip code, and it will do an autocomplete. At least it's supposed to do an autocomplete. There we go. Live demos. There we go. There's my autocomplete. File upload with an XHR, things of that sort. What we decided to do is take this reference portlet and implement it in lots of different technologies. So here is the reference portlet implemented with MVCBean with JSP. So I can do the same thing. I can punch in a zip code. I get my autocomplete. I can upload a file with XHR, fill out the form. One, two, three, 4 is my phone number. That's perfectly fine, date of birth. Hit submit, and it says, thank you, Neil, for applying for a job. So what this reference portlet does is it exercises all the very typical things, form submission, validation, file upload, all those types of things that we have, conversion of dates and so on. So we have that implemented in JSP. We have the exact same thing implemented with Thymeleaf. So instead of a JSP, it's an HTML file and it's using the Thymeleaf templating engine. We have the same thing done with Spring as the inversion of control engine using JSP, and Spring with Thymeleaf. Same application. The code is virtually identical between these 4 examples. It's just what inversion of control engine am I going to use and what templating am I using. Am I going to be using JSP or Thymeleaf? And I have a link here in the presentation where you can find my special branch that has these portlets. I have another example. What we decided to do is we were going to take the MVCBean technology and we were going to teach it. We were going to make it available to the Liferay training department. We're also going to take some of our out-of-the-box portlets that are built with declarative services, just a handful of them, and we're going to refactor them to use MVCBean for Liferay 7.3. So here's an example of a full CRUD application using search container. Anyone ever used Liferay's search container before in a JSP? Okay. This is fully declarative, and also it has integration with friendly URL. I'm going to show you that. So if I hit plus right here, and let's say we have an assignment. This is a CRUD application where we have a professor who is assigning, making assignments for students, and then students come in and do a submission, and then their paper is graded. So let's say we're supposed to read all of Romeo and Juliet, and then I hit save. Oh, I have to do a date in the future, so let's do tomorrow is the due date. I hit save, so now I have a new row in here. You'll notice that the friendly URL up above has the view state for the search container encoded in it. And I think this is a very nice feature because otherwise you can end up with a very long URL. For example, if I go from ascending to descending or so on, you can see how it's just changing right here in this part of the URL from ascending to descending. So whether it's the column that I want to sort by, the order that it's happening, what page of data I'm on, that's all encoded in the URL. This is the view state of the search container itself. So that way we have a nice stateless way of being able to present the master view to the user. If I click on this right here, you can see that the friendly URL is saying that I'm going to view the record with ID 102. If I hit cancel and go back, if I'm going to hit edit right here, you can see that the URL is specifying that I'm supposed to edit record 102 and so on. Now, one of the significant things about Portlet 3 is when I'm going to create an action URL, I am able to make a distinction between action parameters and render parameters. We couldn't do this before with Portlet 1 and Portlet 2. And it's thanks to a new attribute which is called type. So in this code example right here, I'm creating an action URL, and it's going to be available in the expression language under the variable name form action URL. And I'm encoding the view state of the search container as render parameters. So what's that distinction all about? Let's go back here. If I want to edit this record that I created, and I'm just going to make a small change right here. When I hit submit, there are action parameters, which would be the values of the form fields, the title, the description, the date, and so on. I might even have an action parameter on the action URL. But then there's also view state for the search container, which are render parameters. Render parameters control how the portlet will be displayed, how it will be rendered. So that's the distinction. I have action parameters that are part of the form submission, and render parameters that control how the portlet paints itself. So when I hit save, the render parameters are then made available to the master view, and the master view is able to render itself with the correct sort order, the correct sort column, and so on. So I think this is a big improvement over what we've done so far. And this is an animation. I have to give credit to my son Paul, who's here in the audience today. It's nice to see Duke getting excited about OSGi. He did this with a tool called Blender. Shout out to Paul. To Paulie. Thank you. Okay. The way Liferay is able to have this really first-class integration with CDI is thanks to the OSGi CDI integration spec, which was done by Ray Auger of Liferay. So I need to acknowledge Ray for the fine work that he did. It's really tremendous. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited about it is you're able to inject OSGi services into your CDI Bean. So you can see this example right here, where this is actually from the source code of that gradebook example I showed you, the master detail CRUD portlet, where it's using @controller from the MVC spec. So this is when I submit an assignment, when I hit the submit button. And it's using @PortletRequestScope from the Portlet 3 spec, @Inject from JSR 330, and a new annotation called @reference, and you can see that's from, you can see the import above, org.osgi.service.cdi.annotations.reference. That is not the same @reference that we have in declarative services. It's a new annotation, but it should be familiar to you if you have done declarative services portlets. So I just use @inject, I specify @reference, that lets us know that it's actually a service that's found in the OSGi service registry, and I'm going to inject that into my controller class here as the assignment service, and that will allow me to do my CRUD operations, to save, to add or to save a new record using Service Builder. But I can also have a CDI Bean and publish it into the OSGi service registry. Okay, so it's bidirectional with this feature. This is an example of a friendly URL. So we saw that nice friendly URL that was encoding the view state of the search container. This is the code for that. It's simply an application scope bean. I use the @service annotation, which will tell the CDI OSGi integration that this is something that's supposed to be published into the OSGi service registry. And then I might have to specify some attributes there, like where is my friendly URL routes file, and what portlet is this associated with, and so on. The way we do this in declarative services is with the @component annotation. And the @component annotation has kind of a it has kind of a map, right, with name equal value string pairs about all the attributes that you want. So with CDI, it's a little bit more strongly typed. You need to have an annotation that has annotation attributes and so on. But it's basically the same idea. And so this is how you publish a CDI Bean as a friendly URL mapper. Okay, so it's very simple and straightforward. Okay, so that is basically our summary of MVC Bean, which is going to be a feature, again, made available in Liferay 7.3. I have about 11 minutes left. Let me go back and just show you some of the code. Okay. Here are the applicant portlets. If I zoom in, will that work? There we go. Here are the 4 applicant portlets that I showed you. This is the CDI JSP version, the CDI Thymeleaf version, the Spring JSP, and the Spring Thymeleaf. And again, the code for these are virtually identical. In this case, for the CDI one, I'm going to have a beans.xml descriptor, and it's empty. I mean, I'm not really doing any definition in it. In the Spring equivalent of that, rather than having a beans.xml, I'm going to have an application context. Okay. But aside from that, the code is, as I said, virtually identical. If I look at the controller class, the applicant action controller, so this is when I'm filling out the form for first name, last name, date of birth, email address, and so on. Here's the code for that. One thing of note is that this particular type of bean needs to be portlet request scoped. And that's because the applicant POJO, the model, so to speak, is using the @bean param annotation. And that's in the dependent scope. And so in order for this to work, this would have to be a portlet request scope bean. It can't be a singleton. It can't be application scoped. But here's an example where I'm injecting a valid applicant, right? So this applicant is defined right here. And you can see I'm using bean validation where I'm injecting the different form fields, whether it's the city or the date of birth, the email address. And I can put some constraints on there. Can't be blank, has to be an email address, and so on. So these are all from the bean validation spec. And typically in an MVC Bean application, you have the controllers split up. So you'll have an action controller, a render controller, perhaps a resource controller. This would be for the autofill that takes place when I was typing in a postal code or a zip code. When I'm going to delete one of the uploaded files, when I'm going to upload one of the uploaded files. Again, all this code is online. Okay. Well, having taken a look at the MVC Bean code, let's talk a little bit about this new project, which is Portlet MVC4Spring. Anyone ever developed a portlet with Spring Portlet MVC before? Okay, it's a fantastic project. And if you were to ask me, what is the most widely used, the most widely deployed framework for developing portlets out there, I think by far it would be Spring Portlet MVC. But as some of you know, this project was pruned from the Spring framework as of Spring 5. In other words, it's present in Spring 4, but it's not present in Spring 5. And because this was such a popular framework, we reached out to Pivotal and asked them if we could fork this project. And they said, sure, you just have to give the project a new name. You have to change the Java package namespace from org.spring framework to something else. So we did. It's now com.liferay.PortletMVC4Spring. So again, this was originally known as Spring Portlet MVC. We adopted it back in March of this year. And we upgraded it to Spring 5.1, okay, which is important to a lot of our customers and members of our open source community. We did some integration with Spring Security, which means that you have some CSRF protection now that wasn't obvious how to do that before. We upgraded it to Portlet 3. We added some features where you can do file upload via XHR rather than a full-page post back. But we kept the Apache license. And we made sure, of course, that it works with JSP technology, but also, again, with the Thymeleaf templating engine. And this is done with something that's equivalent to something we have from the MVC spec. In Portlet MVC4Spring, we have something called a ViewRenderer. In MVC, it's called a View Engine. Here, it's called a ViewRenderer. OK, so just like we had an archetype for MVCBean, we have an archetype that you can run this command at your leisure, and it will create a sample portlet. And I'll show you what that looks like. Again, it's the same thing. It's just first name, last name, submit. So when I type in Neil Griffin and hit submit, it's a very similar looking type of class to what we had with MVCBean. The difference here is that with Portlet MVC4Spring, we have an application scoped type of bean. In Spring, it's called singleton. Okay, so you'll see that there is no scope annotation on this, so the default would be singleton. And the reason why that's neat is because with Portlet MVC4Spring, you can have a method signature that has pretty much anything you want in it. With MVCBean, it's a little bit more fixed. You have to have render request and render response, or action request and action response. It's a fixed method signature, but with Portlet MVC4Spring, it's variable. It's kind of whatever you want. And in this case, we're injecting a model attribute for the user, what's the binding result, model map, very, very, very similar to MVCBean. But again, this is whereas in MVCBean, it's a Portlet request scoped bean. In Portlet MVC4Spring, it can be application scoped in this case. And that's because the request scope data is being passed here into the method signature. So we don't have any errors here in the binding result, so we log the first name and last name, set a render parameter of success, and hit go. And we get our greeting navigating to a different view. And of course, we took our standard reference portlet for the applicant, which we had in JSF and in MVCBean with CDI, with Spring, with JSP, with Thymeleaf. And we did the same thing, implemented the same thing with Portlet MVC4Spring using JSP and also with Thymeleaf, just to prove that we could take each of these technologies and use them in these fully functional applications and have a common set of tests that we could run against them to make sure it would all work. Right? In the time I have left, I want to show you the integration we have with SenchaJS. As you know, we have a single-page application rendering engine called SenchaJS, and that's built into Liferay, and it kind of automatically Ajaxifies any of the portlets that you've developed if you haven't proactively went ahead and done that. So let me give you an example right here. This is from the MVCBean archetype. I'm actually going to use Firefox for this one here, and I'm going to turn on inspection of the network requests, and I'll go to the MVCBean archetype, and I'll complete the form. If I can spell my name correctly, complete the form. Now, when I hit submit, okay, and it hits my breakpoint, and then I hit go, you'll see that I'm returning a string here that says what view I should be navigating to. And with the MVC spec, I can specify redirect : so that it will do a post redirect get. And what's really neat about this is with Liferay, let me go back to Firefox. With Liferay, that post that's done, you can see here is an XHR. It's not a full page post back. But the status code that comes back is 302, which is a redirect. So then Firefox invokes another XHR, thanks to SenchaJS, which is invoking a URL that's going to render all the portlets on the page server side. But SenchaJS knows it really only needs to update certain parts of the screen. So it is a post redirect get that's done entirely with XHR, updating just the parts of the screen that need to be updated. Okay, and I didn't have to write any code to make that happen. It just works. If I were to turn SenchaJS off, then it would be a full page post back doing a post redirect get. Okay. All right. We have a couple of minutes. Does anyone have a question? If there's not enough time to take a question, or if you'd rather, I can meet with you at the Liferay booth afterwards. But we do have about a minute or so for questions. Anyone have a question? Or was I that thorough? Okay. Yes.
If I have Spring 4,
yeah.
Portlet MVC, how hard is it to upgrade to Spring 5 and Portlet MVC?
Okay. So I can repeat the question. Okay, you have a mic now. Go ahead.
If I have a Spring Portlet MVC for Spring 4, how hard is it to upgrade it to Portlet MVC and Spring 5?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So many of you have developed portlets out there in Spring Portlet MVC, and so we want to know, what do we need to do in order to migrate that? Well, if you were to go to the Portlet MVC4Spring page at GitHub, we do have an entire section there on migration right here, and that will walk you through everything you need to do. It's really almost as simple as a global search and replace of your code of org.springframework to com.liferay.portletMVC4Spring. There are some other things that you need to do, but it's largely global search and replace. You might want to take advantage of some of the security features that we have with integration with Spring Security. That would be some additional work that you need to do, but of course you'd get the CSRF protection by doing that. Something we should all be concerned about. All right, so I'm out of time. If anyone else has a question, I can meet you at the Liferay booth afterwards. And thank you so much for coming today, and I hope you look forward to Liferay 7.3 in the future, and then but Portlet MVC4Spring you can use now with Liferay 7.2. Thank you again for coming.